versatile intellect. He is a man who can bridge cultures and understands history and scholarship and politics and theology and philosophy.
This week is an author, a filmmaker, a former policy advisor to Ronald Reagan.
Mr. Dinesh D'Souza.
This American dream is a dream not just of economic opportunity or success, but it's ultimately a dream where you can be the architect of your own destiny.
I grew up in a different world, actually a world without America. And although I grew up without a phone, without television, without hot water, we had a car, but if you looked down the floor of our car, you could see the ground.
He's been described as an influential conservative thinker. He's a best-selling author, political commentator, and filmmaker.
A great man, Dinesh D'Souza, a patriotic man.
No longer would I say that I live in a rarefied world of intellectual debate. I've seen the upside of America, and I've seen the downside of America. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't trade the United States for any other country. At the end of the day, my enthusiasm for American government may have dimmed, but my enthusiasm for this country burns brighter than ever. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Dinesh D'Souza.
Thank you very much. Wow. Thank you. Thank you very much. Wow. I'm very honored and delighted to be here tonight. I want to commend the Florida Citizens Alliance for what it's doing in this critical area of education. We are living in a crazy time. My mind, as I think about, I met some young people from this room just a few minutes ago, was chatting with them, and it flashed my mind back to when I was 17 years old, and I first saw America. I remember the airplane sort of descending in New York City, and I kind of peered through the window and I could see the New York skyline and I could see the Statue of Liberty. And I remember just a kind of a strange feeling coming over me. And I just realized that my life would be completely different from that moment on. I knew intuitively that I was moving from the margin of the world to the center. And I recognized, however dimly, that I was moving to a country in which I would be able to write the script of my own life. In other words, America is a country in which your destiny isn't given to you, it's constructed by you. It's a country in which your life is more like a blank sheet of paper and you are the artist. And although I didn't understand the basis of that and the constitutional structure that upheld that, I understood that that was the consequence of coming to America. And then as an exchange student saw America, I saw all kinds of things that totally, as they say, blew me away. Not just the abundance of the grocery store with 45 types of ice cream and 35 types of cheese, but also other things. I looked around and You know, in every country, the people who are exceptional, the people who are rich, the people who are powerful have a good life. What really struck me about America was that this was a country in which the ordinary dude, who was not particularly bright and not even all that hardworking, nevertheless had a pretty nice home and a couple of cars in the driveway, and in California or Florida, sometimes a little pool in the backyard. A friend of mine has for a long time been trying to come to America. He hasn't somehow managed to do it. And I finally said to him, "Why are you so eager to come to America?" He goes, "Dinesh, I just want to move to a country where the poor people are fat." And that's the abundance. That's the abundance of American life. But the deeper meaning of America is a country where you can chart your own destiny, where you are in the driver's seat of your own future. And this is, of course, the American dream. The American dream. I guess this is why we keep hearing these days about the dreamers. But other countries don't really have a dream. I mean, there are people there who have dreams, but there's really no Chinese dream or Indian dream. And I think we are living at a time when this American dream hangs in the balance. This is also the significance of one Donald J. Trump. Whom we will have to admit is a very, as my wife says, out there guy. I'm a creature of the Reagan era, and sometimes look back somewhat wistfully on what was a time of gentlemen's politics, in which Reagan and Tip O'Neill could have a pretty acrimonious political fight, but it was conceivable that they could have a Guinness afterward. I don't think they did, but they conceivably could have. Now, this is not the America that we live in now. And Trump is very different than Reagan. I mean, Reagan believed that you can't change the world in 20 different ways. You can change the world in maybe 1 or 2 ways. And so the job of the president is to have a laser-like focus on those things. And Reagan did, and produced enormous change, beneficial change as a result. But it's also true that Reagan let the rest of it go. His view was that that stuff is trivial, I don't care, we're just going to let it be. Trump fights on all fronts. I mean, this guy is fixing the court and passing tax reform and trying to swat Obamacare and do the trade pact, and he finds time to whop Meryl Streep over here and Saturday Night Live over there and take on CNN. Now, I think what Trump's trying to do is fight the political war and the culture war at the same time. He recognizes that the political fight is one corner of the battlefield, and that there's a much larger landscape. The reason this is important is because if you fight only in the political arena, then you are conceding the most powerful institutions of our society, of which I want to name 3. Academia, which includes higher education and elementary and secondary schools. The media, in all its different platforms. And then Hollywood, which is sort of my symbol for the whole entertainment industry. It includes the music industry and Broadway and all the comedians. notice that this is a very one-sided affair. And by that I mean, if you look at the world of comedy, which is where a lot of young people today get their information, not just their sense of how to be cool, but their political information. On the left, you've got Colbert, you've got Jon Stewart, you've got Bill Maher, you've got John Oliver, you've got Ellen, you've got Rosie O'Donnell, and I can keep going. And there's nothing equivalent on the other side. So the point I'm trying to make is that politically, the left has taken over, or largely taken over, what may be called the biggest megaphones of our culture. The ways that information is transmitted to people, often transmitted to people who are not aware that the information that they're getting has been spun. They're getting a narrative that is somebody's point of view, but is not seen as a point of view. People will turn on the news and go, well, that's what happened yesterday. They think it is they look at the media as a neutral transmitter of information, whereas an enormous amount of selectivity and ideological choice goes into what is in fact selected. And this is no less true of the field of education. We hear a lot about fake news, but we don't hear enough about fake scholarship, fake history, fake narratives, which are actually much more powerful than fake news. And here's what I mean. My latest book is called The Big Lie. It's a phrase I actually lifted from, of all people, Hitler. And Hitler makes the point, he says, small lies are actually kind of easy to detect. If somebody tells you a lie, you can compare it to the facts that lie behind it and verify whether what he or she is saying is true. But Hitler's point is that big lies are not like that. Big lies are so big, you can't get your head around them. So, for example, to take the world of politics, if somebody says, the business in Benghazi was all due to a video. Small lie. Pretty easy to figure out. If you want to keep your doctor, you can keep your doctor. Small lie. Pretty easy to figure out. This whole FISA business, it's a lie of omission. You go to a judge, we want to tape the presidential campaign of one of the candidates. We've got a file right here, it's a political file, but you leave out the fact that this is a file manufactured and paid for by the rival political party. You don't say that. And the judge goes, well, sounds very serious, there's probable cause. So by controlling the flow of information, you control not truth, because truth remains what it is, but you control the decision-making that is supposedly made on the basis of truth. Now, a big lie is not like this. A big lie is not something that you can compare to something right next to it and see if the two correspond. So let's say, for example, somebody were to tell you, fascism is a phenomenon of the right. Hitler and Mussolini were right-wingers. And today, fascism can be found in the precincts of conservatism, Christianity, and the Republican Party. Now, you might think that's offensive, or you might think that that's outrageous, but if it is a lie, it is a different kind of lie than the other ones I've mentioned, because you need a great deal of knowledge to be able to speak to this topic. You need a whole background of information. And if you can't get that information in a textbook, or you can't get it in the media, or you can't get it on NPR, or you don't see it in a movie, where are you going to get it? Or let's say you even got it, and let's say you actually know why this is all wrong. Nevertheless, it won't matter, because although you know it's a big lie, you don't have a big enough megaphone to counter it. You're not CNN. You don't have 400 stations like NPR. You're not Steven Spielberg. You don't make movies. So even if you privately know this whole narrative that we're being told is false or is seriously lacking, or there's a whole other side that's missing, you don't have the ability to get that message out. And so in a sense, it remains a private truth that's not going to make any difference in the flow of society at large. What I'm trying to suggest is that many of the big lies that we confront today are cooked in education. That's where they start. That's where they take root. My first book, which I wrote in 1991, was called Illiberal Education, and it looked at a lot of the distortions and biases in higher education, in academia. And at that time, I was in my 20s, and I could sort of masquerade as a student, and so I would go attend classes, and I would note what the professors say, and I would see a lot of craziness going on, but I thought to myself, wow, thank God this is simply the crazy swamp of academia. Can you imagine if these crazy people were let loose into society at large? And then I realized that they are. They are. Because the ideas that are cooked in the world of education are then refracted and amplified by the other institutions of society. And so, for example, a professor might write a book and make an argument. Let's say the argument is that Trump is a fascist because he is an authoritarian and he is a nationalist. Trump wants to make America great again. Well, didn't Hitler want to make Germany great again? This is the argument in a nutshell. Now, on the face of it, the argument as an argument is seriously flawed. It's seriously flawed because it doesn't comprehend in the slightest what fascism even means. The guy who says this has no idea what the fascists were, what they actually believed, and his definitions of fascism don't actually describe fascism at all. So, for example, fascism is not authoritarianism. There have been authoritarian rulers in the world since the beginning of time, going back to the Spartans and the Persians and the ancient Greeks. All over the world, we've had dictators from Pinochet, Idi Amin, Marcos in the Philippines. You can go on and on. Those people were authoritarian, but they obviously aren't all fascists. So fascism isn't simply authoritarianism. And neither is fascism nationalism, not even ultra-nationalism. Nationalism is in fact equally found on the left and on the right. From India, Gandhi was a nationalist. Mandela was a nationalist in South Africa. All the anti-colonial leaders were nationalists. Winston Churchill was a nationalist, as was de Gaulle. Abraham Lincoln was a nationalist, as were the American founders. So does it make any sense to call all these people fascists? No. Obviously, fascism is something other than authoritarianism or nationalism. It may encompass those things, but there's some other distinctive element that's missing. So what I'm getting at is that this book, this argument, would be a lie. It's actually not describing fascism at all. And it's trying to saddle Trump with a label, an incendiary label, because fascism led to Nazism, and Nazism led to the Holocaust, and so all those background associations are haunting the argument, and yet the argument is just flat wrong. But a professor puts it out there, his colleagues proclaim it to be the greatest book written in the 20th century on the subject. Pretty soon he's being interviewed on NPR, he's got a favorable review in the New York Review of Books, the New York Times is doing a feature on him. Then Michael Moore gets wind of it and starts working on his documentary. Either that or Oliver Stone decides to make it into a movie. He's going to cast Matt Damon. So suddenly, this idea that started out in a high school or a prep school or at Middlebury College has metastasized into the larger culture, and it becomes part of the conventional wisdom. And for the ordinary guy, Think about how we get to know things. How do we know certain things happened? How do we know that Rosa Parks refused to sit in the back of the bus? Well, we know it really because we've heard it in multiple places. We read it in a book. And then we happened to be watching the History Channel and we saw, oh yeah, they're talking about Rosa Parks. And then your neighbor mentions it at a cocktail party. And because the information comes from multiple sources, these sources appear to confirm each other. But what I'm saying is, what if at the core of the information, in my example, the idea of Trump being a fascist, what if the core of the information is actually false, and then what you're getting are simply the ricochets and reverberations and echoes of a big lie that is big enough that it would take a great deal of sophistication to be able to counter it? I mention this because in my early career, in the 80s and early 90s, I looked at American politics and American education as being an honest debate. You had two sides, and the two sides had rival points of view, and the rival points of view arose out of different moral commitments. So, for example, the conservatives believe in liberty, but the progressives believe in equality. Now, conservatives believe in equality, but it's equality of rights, equality of opportunity. But the left believes in equality of outcomes. So I looked at American politics as ultimately a kind of Socratic discussion or debate between contending ideas. But I have to admit that as I got older and maybe a little bit more quarrelsome, I decided to make a movie about Obama. I went down to Hawaii and Kenya and Indonesia. I found his brother in a slum in Nairobi. I interviewed him in his hut. Shortly after this, well, I apparently upset the sitting president. And some people said, Dinesh, don't be too fat-headed. What makes you think that Obama cares about your dumb movie? I'm like, well, the reason I think he does is because really 2 weeks after the movie came out, daily attacks on the movie began to appear on a website called barackobama.com. So that's where I got the far-out idea that maybe he was annoyed. But literally fast forward a few months, and who should be at my door but the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Yep, no, it wasn't Comey, but it was some really nice dudes who I discovered soon enough were part of a team that had been assigned to my case. One of them was in charge of reviewing all my bank records, and a second of getting all my tax returns, and a third of reading all my books. And so you suddenly get this sense that the massive power of the US government is trained upon you. A feeling that became extremely vivid when I stood in a New York courtroom and I heard the following phrase, United States of America versus Dinesh D'Souza. Kind of a bone-chilling phrase for any immigrant to hear. And you begin to realize that a lot of your assumptions about a lot of things, I mean, certainly my assumptions about the justice system, because if you had asked me in my 30s that you told me that 98% of people who are accused of a federal crime either plead guilty or are found guilty, I would have said, well, that's because they probably are guilty. Why else would the government be going after them if they didn't do something? It's only when you're in the system that you begin to realize that it's not that simple. The government comes to you and says, hey, Mr. Medical Doctor, we're going to accuse you of having administered illegal pain medication. And you say, well, I'm the doctor, not you. It's not illegal. The person was, in fact, in pain. And they say, well, listen, we're about to file a charge against you that carries a very serious penalty. 5 to 10 years in prison. However, if you will agree to pay a $100,000 fine and not practice for a year, we'll agree to let you off without any jail time, merely an acknowledgement of guilt. Now, here's the interesting question. Even if you're innocent, you're tempted to take that deal. So suddenly I began to realize that this is a different ballgame. They accuse me of X, and the moment I say no, they say, we're going to put 2 other charges on you that carry an additional 5 years in prison. You want to go to prison for 5 years? You can't make any movies, you can't write any books, you can barely make a phone call to your wife. And suddenly you realize that this is also America. In other words, this is not the ideal America. This is not the America of the founders. But this is actually the America we live in now, in which political critics often find themselves in the sights of the most powerful agencies of the US government, not just the FBI, but the IRS, the Department of Justice. And we live in a time when the post office has a SWAT team. We live in a time when the Bureau of Land Management is a SWAT team. And if they're trying to protect a snail dart on your property, they don't show up 4 guys with a folder. They show up with armored cars and automatic weapons and a helicopter flying over your roof. This is also America. Now, I mention all this and I seem not to be directly addressing education, but what I'm trying to say is education is in the middle of all this. We have to remember that education doesn't take place in a vacuum. When Socrates was on the streets of Athens, we try to imagine an idealized environment, almost the perfect educational setting. Here's Socrates, and he's got a lot of time on his hands. He doesn't even really have a job. He's just a guy who asks questions. And you've got all these students who just are eager to learn. What is justice? What is truth? What's your definition? What's yours? But we have to remember that when Socrates was doing this, Athens is in the middle of a terrible war. That in some sense, the people on that street knew would quite possibly destroy the Athenian lifestyle permanently. Athens was going to sink, never to rise again. And no one could have foreseen that the Romans, who would replace the Greeks, would take up the Greek philosophy and take up the Greek theater, because no one knows the future. We know this through the hindsight of history. But the people living there must have felt that that knowledge, that truth, any truth that they were able to get their hands on was extremely fragile and very likely to be blown to bits by Spartan hoplites or or drowned in the Mediterranean in a trail of blood. So the educational debate in America now is occurring at a time when the things that it is about, what does America mean? The very questions that the founders thought about are in the balance. Are we a nation of laws or of men? Is it the case that we play by neutral rules? Do judges interpret the Constitution by looking to the motives of the people who wrote it? Or are judges imposing their view on the Constitution, and their constitutional decision is a kind of charade? It's a rationalization for something that they decided to do in advance. They're ultimately giving you a sort of a spin, but they're not honestly looking to see why that law was made and by whom and for what purpose, and don't see their role the way an umpire should in a baseball game of implementing the purpose of the rule in a given situation. We're seeing a debate over whether the judge should even do that. Now, a lot has been made about how in schools today and colleges today, even good colleges and even good schools, young people don't know cultural literacy. They don't know the basics. They don't have that simple fund of knowledge that was taken for granted 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And I think that's true. But I also want to suggest that alongside that, there's something else that is equally, if not more important, that we miss. And that is that in America, from the beginning, let's say from the founding, right until the 60s and 70s, Americans believe that there is a moral order in the universe that is external to us, that makes claims on us. You can think of the 10 Commandments as reflecting that kind of a moral order. Now, interestingly, that this concept of a moral order was not exclusively religious. You didn't have to be Catholic or Protestant or Jewish to believe that the 10 Commandments was a good way to live. In America in 1940, you could approach anybody on the street and say, do you think the 10 Commandments is by and large a good way for people to live? And 99.9% of Americans would have answered, well, yeah. Now, what's changed now is not that some people say, well, we've lost morality, we've gone away from morality. Not quite. It's not that we've abandoned morality, but what's really happened in America in the last generation is a shift in the source of morality. A shift away from the external moral order to what can now be called the inner self. The inner self. The inner self is now, the I, is seen as the final arbiter of morality. So you take a young person who's faced with some kind of a decision, not even necessarily a moral decision. It doesn't even have to be some kind of a theological or even ethical choice. Something so simple as, should I go to law school or become a poet? And how do young people decide? Do they consult their parents or their preacher or their teacher? Do they look to some external code to supply the answer? No. They dig into themselves and they look to that internal referee inside of them to decide the issue finally. That is, if I may say so, their trump card. That decision cannot be appealed. So what we're seeing, in other words, is, you may almost call it a new source of morality, the morality of the inner self. And it's taken for granted in the younger generation. This is a great moral shift. Now, is it a good shift? Is it a bad shift? I don't want to decide that now. I will just say that it's something very new in the world. My own father or grandfather would never have understood it. I remember actually talking to my dad many years ago. He had aspired for me to apply to business school. I had applied to business school. I got into the Wharton Business School. I was all set to go. And then I decided to pivot and go to Washington and become a writer. And I remember this conversation with my dad. I go, Dad, I'm thinking of becoming a writer. He goes, son, I think you should do something useful with your life. And I said, well, he goes, it makes so much more sense for you to go to business school. You can actually get a really productive job. You can earn a good living. You're in a new country. You can have stability and so on. And I said, well, Dad, and here I'm appealing to the new morality. I go, I kind of feel called to be a writer. I feel this kind of inner impulsion that's driving me toward being a writer. And my dad says, well, Dinesh, what you seem to be saying is that there is a little being that lives inside of you. Let's call him Little Dinesh. You appear to make important decisions about your life by consulting that little creature. And listening infallibly to what it says. And I realized as this conversation proceeded that it wasn't that my dad disagreed with me. He didn't know what the hell I was talking about. So, now, what in society is a kind of crisis, we talked today about how America is divided, and it is from an educational point of view kind of an opportunity. And by that I mean, it is a chance to really step back and think. And all education is really about the experience of wonder. If we think about what education means, and I always think of education as a lifelong thing, and I feel sad. I sometimes go to my college reunions, I meet Dartmouth guys, super smart, and these are people that we would sit around and talk about big issues when we were 19 and 20. But these are guys who, outside of their professional field, have actually not read a book in 30 years. They haven't. And I'm not saying they don't have time and life intervenes and it's very busy and all that. But what I'm getting at is that original experience of wonder that you have when you're 5 years old and you say, Dad, why is the sky blue? Why? Why? The curiosity and the delight in figuring it out, we lose that as adults, many of us. But it is a very precious thing, and it is the job of teachers and professors to nourish that. Isaiah Berlin, the writer, once said that when you think of the greatest philosophers like Kant and Hegel, who write with unbelievable complexity, Berlin says that their ideas at the core extremely simple. All the philosophy is just an elaborate barricade of argument intended to defend something that is at the core of it extremely simple. At the core of it, Darwin's insight is extremely simple, and Einstein's as well, and Immanuel Kant's. Immanuel Kant looks at the world, and every previous thinker for thousands of years had assumed that when we look at the world out there is exactly the way that we experience it. What we see is what you get. And Kant says, not only that is questionable, but that it can't possibly be true. It can't possibly be true. In fact, we have no way of knowing it's true. Normally, if somebody says something is like something else, you can always compare the two. If somebody says, your painting of the ocean, it looks a lot like the ocean. Let's look at the painting. Let's look at the ocean. Let's see if the two are really similar. But now we take a different question. Our perception of the world, the way we experience it, is in fact the way the world really is. Something we take for granted, but Kant says, now we are not in a position to compare. We don't have the world as it is, and we don't have our perception, and we can't compare the two. All we have is our perception, and that's all we ever will have or can have as long as we remain human. We have no way to compare the experience or the perception to the original. There is no original accessible to us. Anyway, well, what I'm getting at with all this is I'm trying to say that this is what education is becoming excited about all this. Which brings us right back down to earth. And that is that the concept of education I've been talking about, and notice it's not fundamental. I've given some political examples, but at the core, education isn't about politics. It includes an understanding of politics, but it includes an understanding of algebra, and an understanding of literature, an understanding of art and beauty, many other things. This education that, again, is the core of what makes us human and what makes us grow, has become not only controversial, but it has become degraded and debased by a political assault on its core principles. A political assault that has actually manipulated it. There's a reason that we say young people don't know much about the American founding. That's not innocent. Young people don't know much about the American founding because certain people have decided that that's not important for them to know about. Yes, it's true. Last year in my movie, Hillary's America, I made a statement. I said, in 1860, the year before the Civil War, I said, no Republican owned a slave. Not no Republican leader owned a slave, no Republican in the country owned a slave. All the slaves in the United States, 4 million of them, were owned by Democrats. Now, you might ask why I would make such a statement. The reason I made it is I would go to campuses and speak about the topic, and professors in very good colleges would typically say to me something like this, well, Dinesh, you've made some excellent points, but I find your talk extremely simplistic. You've got to realize that on difficult topics like slavery, there's a great deal of blame to go around. Both parties are implicated, and there's a lot of wrongdoing on all sides. It would be good of you to at least acknowledge that. So this is the kind of squid-like cloud of obfuscation that it is my career desire to puncture. So hence my outrageous statement. But it's outrageous only in the sense that it's actually a beautifully scientific claim. Scientific in the sense of being eminently refutable. I'm not making some abstract claim, I'm making a factual claim, and all you have to do is give me the name of one Republican who owned a slave, and I would have to take it back and eat crow. But to this date, there has not been a single counterexample. One guy, a PhD student at the University of Michigan, I believe, wrote me several months ago. He goes, Dinesh, I gotcha. Ulysses S. Grant inherited a slave, a solitary slave, mind you, on his wife's side. And I said, well, ordinarily that might be kind of a touche. But I do wish to point out to you that at the time that this happened, Ulysses S. Grant was a Democrat. So he became a Republican later. Now, I say this, I'm not telling you this to score a point or toot a horn. The reason I'm telling you this is that this statement, no Republican owned a slave, does not appear in any American history textbook that I have ever been able to locate, either in the high school or the elementary school or the college level. It does not appear in any history of the Civil War. There are many eminent scholars who have written about this topic, from James McPherson, Shelby Foote, many others. This statement appears in none of them. And yet, it is undeniable in the sense that there are very knowledgeable people in front of whom I've put the statement, and they are completely unable to refute it. It's true, but it's not a truth that appears anywhere. And so this creates, in education, a kind of a problem, which is someone says something, and I find this experience when I speak on campus. I'll be speaking at Yale at the end of this month. This is going to be the experience. I'll stand up and I'll say 25 things, and the students will stare at me with the same constipated expression that Wolf Blitzer had on his face on election night. Right? It'll be just... Or the same hand in the cookie jar look that Adam Schiff has every day. And they look as if I have just slapped them. Because all the stuff I'm telling them, they've never heard. But then after a while, I realize that they begin to really, it discombobulates them, because they say to themselves, how can what this guy says be true? If it is true, how is it that I, an intelligent person, have never heard this? How is it that I never read it? No one ever says it. No one ever talks about it. Not even in National Review. Not even in the conservative side. So what I'm getting at is we're in a period of educational crisis where information is so twisted, so spun, that the truth is very hard to find at the bottom of it all. I discovered, and I don't want to run over my time, and I do want to leave some time for questions. I'll bring this to a close. I'll try to adopt the motto that King Henry VIII used with one of his wives. He said, "I won't keep you too long." So in 1935, the most senior Nazis in Germany got together in the Justice Department to draft the notorious Nuremberg laws, which were laws that made Jews into second-class citizens. And the Nazis had a stenographer present, and one of them announced, "This is a very historic occasion. We are creating the world's first racist state. We're going to have laws that prevent Jews from intermarrying with Germans. We're going to have segregation of the Jews into ghettos, and we're going to have state-sponsored discrimination against the Jews, which will result in the confiscation of their property." This is fantastic. And one of the Nazis puts up his hand and he says, "Sir, I hate to say this, but we cannot create the world's first racist state because the Democratic Party in the United States has already done it. They have beaten us to the punch. Everything that we want to do, they've done." Now, for a moment you may go, what's Dinesh talking about? Well, he goes on to explain. He says, we want to outlaw intermarriage, racial intermarriage. Racial intermarriage is outlawed in 20 states in America. We want to have segregation. The Democrats have Jim Crow. We want to have state-sponsored discrimination. Check. So this Nazi goes, our job is really easy. We have to take these democratic laws, cross out the word black, write in the word Jew, and we're home free. Now, this totally discombobulates the Nazis. They adjourn the meeting. They demand the production of the democratic laws. And they basically do what the young Nazi called for. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 that Nazis wrote are directly lifted from blueprints supplied by the Democratic Party in the United States. Now, I should point out something that is also not known. People say, what are you talking about? What democratic laws? Every Jim Crow law in the American South was passed by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Democratic governor, enforced by Democratic officials. There's no exception to this rule. So the Nazi was right. But the Nazi was saying something that most very well-educated American students don't know. Why? Because it doesn't appear in a single textbook. It's not in a single news article. There's never been a TV show about it. The big PBS series, Eyes on the Prize, Ken Burns' big documentaries on the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement exclude this kind of information. If you read biographies of FDR, you don't realize that right in the middle, right in the moments leading up to World War II, not only were the Nazis getting ideas from the American left and the Democratic Party, but there was an awful lot of traffic the other way around. All of this buried in the mist of history. Now why? Why was it buried? It was buried because after World War II, Nazism became equated with Holocaust. And the progressives who were coming to power in academia, who were starting to run the schools and run the colleges, they go, this information is radioactive. If young people knew this, basically we, meaning the progressives, would be finished. We'd be done. We cannot afford to have this information get out. And so we're just not going to talk about it. And here's the point. You need to be dominant in academia and the media and Hollywood to pull this off. To pull off a big lie, you need all three. But the left has all three. And even though we say, oh, Trump's victory is precarious. It's temporary. It's this election. The dominance of the left in education, in media, in Hollywood, pretty permanent. Pretty permanent. But I'm glad we're fighting it. I'm glad you're fighting it. And I'm glad we have an alliance right here that is fighting it. It's an uphill fight. Yes, it's a fight for parental choice. Yes, it's a fight for homeschoolers. Yes, it's a fight against ideological bias. But to me, at the core of it, it's a fight for that primordial feeling of wonder that you have when you're a 5-year-old kid. All education comes out of that. And Socrates recognized that. That's why Socrates' questions are so innocent. And that's why they're so basic. They go right back to the core of things. And that's where knowledge is. Education is just a sophistication to defend that truth against all comers. But I've been meeting young people here tonight who are very impressive. I was actually interviewed by a 6th grader who is just spectacularly mature and left me with the question. She said, I don't know if you are looking for actresses in your movies, but if you are, have your people contact my people. And with that, she returned her pen to her sleeve and marched right out the door. I want to thank you for supporting this organization that is fighting hard in this critical state. Ultimately, this is a fight over our own country's future. Education is a part of that. You are a part of that. I'll leave you with an anecdote that a professor of mine once told me. It's the story of the lion tamer and the lion. And here's the lion tamer, kind of a puny guy with a stick. And here's the lion, big scary lion. And the lion tamer twirls a stick, and the lion follows the instructions of the lion tamer. And my professor asked a simple question: who is actually more powerful, the lion tamer or the lion? Well, obviously it's the lion. But then the question arises, why is the lion obediently following the instructions of the lion tamer? Why is the lion so sycophantic in the face of a weaker power? And the answer is that the lion doesn't know its own power. The lion thinks the lion tamer is more powerful. And that's our position. As parents, here we are as citizens, and we have all these big totemic leaders, and they're the lion tamers. And they act high and mighty, and they tell us what to do. We know better. We don't want you reviewing the curriculum of the Florida schools. What do you know about that? I'm Obama. I took a course in constitutional law. I've written 2 books, admittedly both about myself. But I know better. I'm the lion tamer, but the point I want to make is that no, in the end of the day, the real power remains with us, the citizens. We have it. And we don't just have it on election day. If we are hands-on, we have it every day. And that's why I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be calling you to this higher task, which demands effort and resources and intelligence and creativity. But we have it. The power of the lion is there for us. We should take it. We should learn to use it. We should learn to roar. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I'm told we have a few minutes for questions. I want to keep it brief, but I'll keep it moving. So I'll take a few questions. Do we have? We have a student. Pardon me? Okay, let's start with the young man right there.
All right. So in today's nation, charter schools happen to be very successful and influential. Many of the students in these schools, I feel, have that wonder that you talked about. But, however, they're not given the same funding as the ordinary public school. How do you feel about this issue?
The key to providing a quality product, not just in education, but in any field. This would apply equally to healthcare. It would apply equally to food. Here's what I'm trying to get. People talk about rights. We have a right to healthcare. Okay. You also have a right to eat. But can you imagine if you had a food policy in which you would go to the grocery store and you would load up your cart, show up at the counter, but you don't have to pay. Somebody else is going to pay. What would happen? Well, the first thing you would do is, instead of buying 1 carton of milk, you'd buy 10. You would simply consume as much as you possibly could, and then you'd show up at the counter, and something interesting would happen on the other side of the counter. That the people who own the grocery store would realize you're not paying. So the price of the products would escalate. And so milk, which used to cost $2.50, would now cost $25. But you don't care because you're not paying. Some third guy is paying. So if you try to think about it, what's the solution to this? The solution to this is the consumer, the person who's using the product, should be directly accountable to it. And in education, what that means is the consumer here is, of course, the student, but also the parent who is the parent who is in charge of that student. And so to me, the key to education is to move the base of authority, power, away from the education establishment and the unions and into the hands of the students and the parents. That's the key. That's the key. So charter schools, in my view, should not be treated differently. They're not the poor second cousin of the public school system. As you say, they're often leading the way. And so, but I would like to see a perfect neutrality, not just among public schools, but also between public and private schools. In all cases, the authority lies with the parent. This would benefit all parents. It would especially benefit minority parents who often are in a very difficult situation and are getting a horrible education with absolutely no choice in the matter. Okay? Other questions? Yes, okay, right. Yes, go ahead, sir.
My name is Jonathan Alias, and I attend a school named Mason Classical Academy. Our uniform crest reads Virtus et Scientia, which is Latin for virtue and knowledge. One way our school develops virtue in its students is through the study of classical literature. For example, my class has already studied Shakespeare, Frankenstein, Pride and Prejudice, Of Mice and Men, Moby Dick, and much more. Right now we are studying Huckleberry Finn. Do you feel American schools are using curricular materials that help develop a virtuous and knowledgeable citizenry?
You're asking actually a very profound question, which is the purpose of education merely knowledge, or does it extend to something else that can be called a virtue? Now, the reason this is a profound question is that for about 100 years, there has been a shift in understanding of this topic, in which in academia today, a distinction is made between facts and values. Facts and values. So, the Declaration of Independence was issued in 1776. That is a fact. All men are created equal is not a fact. It is a value. And by a value, what I mean is, and here I'm not endorsing this view, I'm describing it. The idea is that while facts can be known, values are subjective. By subjective, we mean they depend on the person who agrees with them. They are relative to each individual and perhaps even relative to different groups or cultures. And out of this comes what we now know as relativism. Cultural relativism, which is that knowledge is relative to different cultures, and moral relativism, which is the idea that there is no moral truth. All truths may be true for you or for me, but they aren't true, period. So here's what I'm saying. Part of education is to study knowledge and virtue, and also to be familiar with this debate about facts and values, and to be able to give an intelligent answer. If you don't agree that morality is relative, you need to be able to say why. You need to be able to counter the moral relativism that is a very powerful current in our time. In fact, when you go on to college and you say, I want to read Huckleberry Finn, somebody will say, why is Huckleberry Finn any better than the journals of a transsexual traveling through the Southwest? Why not read that book? Are you saying that Huckleberry Finn is a better book? And on what basis? What makes you say it's better? I don't think it's better. That is your truth, but it's not my truth. So how do you, when truth itself is thrown up for grabs, how do you adjudicate the matter then? So this is, I'm not disagreeing with you. I agree with you. But I'm simply pointing the way that you should think about all this. that you're in a classical academy where you're learning things and taking for granted that this is what Matthew Arnold called the best that has been thought and said. And the moment you set foot on a college campus, the first words you're going to hear is, says who? Says who? And you have to be able to answer that. So I'm just giving you a little motivational prep for the next battle to come, and I want you to be ready for it. Okay. Go ahead.
Hello, Mr. D'Souza. My name's Alex Pilkington. I'm treasurer for the College Republicans up at FGCU. Recently, our school made national headlines when a professor decided to start teaching a course entitled White Racism. Some of the backlash from that class called upon the discontinuation of the course. In response to this backlash, our president said, in order to uphold academic freedom and integrity, we're going to allow this class to continue. What would you say is the line between academic freedom and censorship?
Your question in its sort of diabolical complexity raises in my mind the thought I should probably have cut off the questions before you got up to speak. But anyway, here's my take on it. If I were a conservative, I would not object to the teaching of the course, because I would anticipate that the moment I did that, the university would move into its autopilot mode and scream academic freedom, which would immediately put you on the defensive, making you now appear to be an enemy of academic freedom itself. What I would do is two things. There is kind of the gentleman's approach, and let's call it the Trumpian approach. And there's a lot to be said for both. So I'm going to outline both. The gentleman's approach would be to go up to the professor and say, I don't really agree with some of the things that you've been saying. It's not that I disagree with the horrific portrait of racism that you've been describing, but nowhere have you actually pointed out that the Democratic Party, which you happen to belong to, has actually been the party of slavery and segregation and racial terrorism and Jim Crow. And 99% of all the grand dragons of the Ku Klux Klan have been Democrats, with the solitary exception of David Duke. And of all the racist Dixiecrats that you say moved over to the Republican Party, you can't name more than one, because there is in fact only one, Strom Thurmond, and there are no others. And all the racist Dixiecrats lived and died as Democrats. And you haven't told us any of this. So one of the most important aspects of your course, which is you say America did this and America did that, but America did none of it. Some Americans did it and other Americans stopped them. And the people who did it were called Democrats and the people who stopped them were called Republicans. And you seem to be leaving that out of your course. That's an academic refutation. The Trumpian answer would be to say nothing, but to go to the class with a concealed tape recorder and record everything that the professor says, which you should then review, pulling up incendiary nuggets for social media that should then be dispatched to Breitbart, Tucker Carlson, Dinesh, and several other disreputable characters who would know exactly what to do with them. Which approach do I recommend? By weighing the two consequences, I would say there's no need to compromise. Go with both. Okay, we have a question right here in the front by
Dinesh.
Be warned, this is coming from a fellow Dartmouth guy.
Dinesh, the motto of Dartmouth has to do with a voice crying in the wilderness. Now, why does Yale have you coming, and how many times have you been to Dartmouth? Speaking.
Question is, well, over the past several years, I've spoken probably 2 or 3 times at Dartmouth, but I have never been invited by Dartmouth. Now, I think this actually goes back to my undergraduate days. I was, along with several others, involved in a rebel campus newspaper. And we made a lot of trouble for the faculty and the university establishment. In fact, people would say that taking on our newspaper was a bit like wrestling with the pig, because not only did it get everyone dirty, but the pig liked it. And I think that some of the wounds that I seem to have left behind in the early 1980s have evidently not healed, because the faculty won't invite me back. But I am going to Yale, where I'm going to make an attempt to debate one of the leading scholars of fascism, if I can get him to come out from under his desk. I'm not sure if that will actually occur. Okay, maybe take one more question. Yes, sir. Do you mind? Oh yeah, a mic would be good.
There you go. Thank you. So your anecdote, I'm thinking about a parent in place of the Lime and Tamer. And in place of the lion, I'm thinking about a kid with a smartphone. And I'm interested in your take on, I mean, I understand and I appreciate the role of folks like the Florida Citizens Group in combating the erosion of educational principles that a lot of us think are fundamental. But the real danger, in my view, is social media. And the kids get a lot of their education and a lot of their view of the world from their phones, right? So what do you think about parental responsibilities as it relates to the evil empire here, you know, Facebook and stuff like that?
My view on this is colored by the fact that as of a few years ago, I had nothing to do with social media. In fact, my assistant would post on social media for me, and I'd go to places and people would say, you said this and you said that, but it wasn't actually me. So I was off of social media. And then I sort of put my toe in the water. And I started on Facebook and Twitter, not so much on Instagram, although I'm doing that now as well. And I realized that social media is a kind of two-sided beast. Yes, it can be addictive, intoxicating. There's a lot of junk on social media. It's repetitive. In some ways, you could say it's a little bit like watching Fox News 12 hours a day. It's very repetitive. At the end of the day, you say, I only learned one point that was asserted repeatedly 800 times. But it then occurs to you that had there not been Fox, you would never have heard this point at all. So social media is also a very powerful weapon for striking back at the bad guys. It has removed the exclusivity. Before social media, the power of, say, the New York Times. The New York Times is still very powerful, don't get me wrong. But its power was almost unquestioned. One of the reasons the media is so indignant about Trump is the media has this shared view at the top that they are actually the platonic guardians of the society. That there are guardrails put up by them. And no one, not even the American people, gets to elect a guy who chooses to walk off that established path. If you do, they will destroy you, and you will never recover from this. And this is the key to understanding, by the way, why our team, the leaders of our team, people say to me, well, why was John Boehner such a wimp? Why is McConnell such a wimp? Well, the reason that these guys are wimps is they're terrified of the media. They're terrified of the media because they know that if CBS News, NPR, the Boston Globe puts you in their sights and takes you on for 6 weeks, they will destroy you so badly that your own side will bury you. Our team knows that, and they are inwardly petrified by it. This explains Romney and McCain and all these guys. Now, it doesn't explain Trump, because Trump is a street guy, and he's outside this camp, and he's not scared of them. And although people are constantly telling me, oh, Dinesh, Trump, his Twitter, if only take away his Twitter, please take away his Twitter. I'm like, take away his Twitter? And do what? Give it to you? What would you do with it? Because although Trump is an outsider and not an intellectual, Trump actually in this area is an extremely good cage fighter. He has incredibly good instincts. He not only can throw a punch, but he knows how to take a punch. And so for these reasons, I'm ambivalent about social media. I recognize its limitations. I would never claim that social media is a valid form of education. And I'm tired of all these left-wing Wikipedia scholars who challenge my books on the basis of, it says in the 3rd line of Wikipedia that fascism is right-wing, Dinesh. So this is actually, I don't even know what to say. Except that, give me 15 minutes and I'll get on Wikipedia and it'll say it's left-wing, because anybody can write on Wikipedia. There's a reason that in no reputable academic precinct can you cite Wikipedia. So social media has limitations, but politically, it's also invaluable to us right now. So let me sum up here by saying that in this room, there are about 500 people. In a single state like Florida, this is a very powerful constituency. Most of us use a very small fraction of our actual influence. Even on social media, people say, well, Dinesh, social media, I've only got 25 friends on Facebook. Well, yeah, but they've got 25 friends on Facebook. So in other words, if you know how to collect information and get it out, and you know how to make it stick, if you know how to make information infectious, if you're interesting about it. And one thing I'll tell you, the Trumpsters are much better at this than the traditional Republican. The Trumpsters are clever, and the Trumpsters hit really hard. So at some level, I regret it. And by that I mean, at some level, I regret that we've moved away from the Reagan era of gentleman's politics. But ask yourself how we got Trump. The reason we got Trump is that Republicans tried nominating the good guy, Romney. And Romney's like St. Francis. There's nothing on that guy, right? And yet, in 15 minutes, the left made him look like Lucifer. They basically savaged him for having money. And here was poor Romney, hanging in the wind, twisting, invertebrate, unable to respond. And then here comes Trump, who actually has a lot more money than Romney. But you notice no one has accused Trump of having too much money, because it doesn't work. If you tell him he has too much money, he sits you down and tells you he has even more money than you think. So we need to surf on the wave, recognizing that the times have changed. For this moment, I think we need a tough guy. Yeah. And we need a guy who knows that there's a big fight going on, including about education. And I'll leave you with this thought that I learned somewhat to my surprise over the years, that the guy who articulates and fights for a thing may actually not embody the thing in his own life, odd though that seems. Because we always say things like, well, we want a president who has character. We want a president who has served in the military and has military virtues. Well, George H.W. Bush was a military hero. Bob Dole was a military hero. Reagan was not a military hero. Reagan made war movies in World War II. But you line up a group of 100 Marines, Send out George H.W. Bush. Hello, hello. Send out Bob Dole. He makes a few jokes. I'm Bob Dole. Don't call, you know. And then send out Reagan. And watch whom the Marines salute with passionate enthusiasm. They salute not the guy who served in the military, but the guy who defends the martial virtues and provides political leadership for them. And similarly with Trump, on the face of it, you'd say, how can this guy possibly be the Republican, conservative, Christian candidate for the presidency? And then you realize that in one whopping blow, this is the guy who saved the Supreme Court. So politics is the art of what can be done. It's not the Platonic empyrean. It's not the world of the ideal. And part of education is recognizing the ideal, but also recognizing the world in which we live, in which all ideals will be imperfectly realized. Imperfectly realized. This is our mission, and even though the other side is strong, I think that just like last November, we are in the position to pull this off. You are in the position to pull this off, so let's pull it off. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.